Well, I think that Islam, and if you read or follow what I've been saying, that is throughout the years, I mean, I've been somebody who said that Islam is a great religious faith. It's a faith that transforms people's lives, and it's a very important faith. At the end of the day, I am not a Muslim. So, you know, I think many people can feel that way. I mean, I like to think that there are Muslims who respect Christianity and what Christianity, you know, stands for. And I think that that's what's important in our world. Whether or not I am a Muslim is something that or whether or not I would become a Muslim is something that, whether it's myself or somebody else, that's a personal decision.
Yeah, it's between you and God. Professor, one of the things which happened after September the 11th was we heard of a lot of shuttle visits by U.S. administration officials to Islamic countries requesting them to change in a way or modify their education systems. We've seen that happening in Egypt and some Gulf states.
Those are the good old days when they did it for shopping, but go ahead.
So, do you think that's wise to interfere into the education system of these countries?
I think there's a big difference. If you have a concern, there's a big difference between quietly talking to your counterpart. There's a big difference between quietly talking to your counterpart, to your ally in many cases, quietly doing that, as opposed to publicly posturing and appearing to, by going public, to be telling another country what they have to do. I think there's a difference. I certainly think people have a right. I mean, let's face it, I'm here. Part of our discussion tonight is people talking about what's wrong with America and how America ought to change, etc. But when you're at the level of government and rulers, if an Arab ruler has a major problem, you know, with the American president, I think the first thing is you do it privately. If you feel that going public then becomes necessary, for example, as I said earlier with regard to the Palestinian issue, if you feel that your private entreaties haven't worked, your sort of vague general statements, you know, haven't been heard, then you might want to get stronger. But I think that it is counterproductive for the American government to project an image that it is trying to dictate, and that's the way it's often perceived, to the government of Egypt or to Saudi Arabia what they ought to be doing with the curriculum. And certainly I think it also has to be done in a very modified way. There may be problems in the Egyptian and the Saudi curriculum, but just as there are problems in a lot of other people's curriculum, in terms of, I mean, many here could, as many Americans, could critique American culture in terms of the violence that is, you know, in our media, and it contributes to violence, our attitude towards guns, etc. But I think that it's counterproductive to engage in a kind of you know, public criticism, what seems to be a public criticism and a public posture, and more than that, to give the impression that one is going to attempt to twist the arm of someone else. I think you use a lot of incentives, etc., to get your way.
Professor, what are, in your opinion, the main challenges facing Islam or the Islamic countries in the years to come, especially after what happened in September?
Very briefly, because in my book I talk about the U.S., and I've already been through that in terms of re-examining U.S. foreign policy. I think Muslim governments are challenged to open up their systems, more political participation, more human rights, etc., to represent the very ideals that many Muslims like to say that Islam represents. They're challenged not to see the war on terrorism as a green light, which will enable them to be even more repressive towards any and all opposition, as many of the Central Asian governments have. You know, feeling that, as in the Cold War, that as long as they're allies with America in the war, maybe offering American troops to come there and set up bases, that means that they can move against both their mainstream and radical opposition. I think the other thing is having to deal with what is going on in many Muslim societies. I see a struggle within Muslim societies between mainstream and extremists. And regrettably, the extremists are usually, although a minority, they're usually the loudest, the most provocative. And I think there's a struggle for, as it were, for Islam. that is occurring in many Muslim societies. And part of that is to deal with what I call a theology of hate. It exists among extremists in Christianity, in Judaism, in Hinduism, or we see it, in India today, and it exists among Muslim extremists. It's a theology of hate, which is not only aimed at the West; it's aimed at their own societies.
Professor, is there common points in which Christianity, Judaism, and Islam can meet at least and never have arguments? Or
well, I think that there are significant points. I think that the differences, certainly you don't want to do away with them, but that they can exist and be celebrated, or at least be accepted, that there are going to be differences. But the points that I gave before, the religious worldview, the basic religious worldview, belief in one God, prophets, and revelation, but it's more than that. Devout Muslims, Christians, and Jews are all concerned about the excesses of modernity, the excesses with regard to materialism. There's nothing wrong with materialism. There's nothing wrong with trade, etc. I mean, the Prophet was a merchant and a trader. This has always been part and parcel. I always explain to people in the West, Islamic society has no problem with profit margin. But it's the excesses, the concern with regard to family and family values, the concerns about human rights, concerns about ecology. There are many things that are shared in common across concern with drugs and the spread of drugs across the spectrum. And these are the things that I think people need to come together and work on together. Well,
Professor, we thank you for being with us and for sharing your views about Islam in the eyes of the West. Dear viewers, that was Professor John Espasido, who came specifically in Bahrain today to have this discussion with us. We hope to see you next week on another edition of Highlights. Thank you for being with us.